So good morning, all. I drew the honor of introducing our first keynote speaker today. So he is the senior U.S. Senator from Wisconsin and currently the chair of the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs. So please, everybody, welcome Senator Ron Johnson. Short and sweet.
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Ari. I've got your agenda here for today. I always, I get a lot of requests for speaking engagements, and I always kind of face these with a fair amount of trepidation, where you're really talking to a bunch of experts that know the subject. These are not trick questions. Let me first start out. How many are old enough in this room to remember Gilligan's Island? Good. They'll come in a little later. Next question. Show of hands. How many people think the federal government is efficient and effective? I'm looking. How many think it's pretty broken, dysfunctional? You are correct. I've asked that question literally to, I don't know, maybe literally tens of thousands of Wisconsinites, other people around the country. In the last couple of years in asking that question, I've maybe had a couple hundred people raise their hand. I mean, the true committed big government types of folks. That is the assessment of the American public. It's an accurate assessment. And I think it's incredibly relevant for your discussions here today because the federal government is inefficient. It's ineffective. It's pretty broken. It's pretty dysfunctional. Our founders were geniuses. They realized that, we're men and women. We need government. We don't want to live in anarchy and chaos. But they also realized that as government grew, it necessarily took away our freedoms. And they also knew the government was not going to be particularly effective at what it does. And so Ari mentioned history. Let me just give you a brief history in terms of what my background is and how I've come to be involved in this issue. Ran a manufacturing operation for 30-some years. My degree program's in accounting. In that time, I had an IT guy that had used a lot of duct tape with my IBM PC. I was still using the smaller, not the big floppies, the smaller floppy disks when I ran for Senate in 2010. I was always resistant to all the electronic resourcing systems, the things that connect you to the internet, because I knew we'd be vulnerable. I'd gone through so many resource management types of systems in sister companies, and I just saw these people spend millions of dollars and fail, and then get hacked and have their systems down, have to revert to paper systems. So my own viewpoint coming into this process from the private sector is keep your basic important information offline because it's vulnerable. Do as many things in a modular way as possible. That's just my background. We also, when it was purchased by a larger British company, they immediately made us get ISO certified as a manufacturer. And that by the way, ISO certification can be really helpful for a business, but let's face it, it's really great for the consulting class, with 6-month surveillance. But what I tried to do within that ISO, which was absolutely necessary to our medical device customers, as well as to my corporate masters, utilize that framework, that surveillance process to the greatest effect. Use it. Try and take the complexity of that, simplify it as much as possible so you actually make it usable. I'll talk about that a little bit later as well. So anyway, I run for U.S. Senate. I win. I joined Homeland Security. And one of the first hearings we had was on cybersecurity. And the message from everybody is, we got to do something about this. Government's got to do something about it. Hearing after hearing, I would always ask the witnesses, well, what are if the government had to do something, what are the top 2 things you want government to do? It was always very consistent. Information sharing and data breach notification. So some kind of national preemptive data breach. I thought those were no-brainers. So in that process, this is with Joe Lieberman and Susan Collins were chairman and ranking member. They started working on a cybersecurity bill. I think in the end, it ends being something like 400 pages. I was actually in the room with probably about 8 to a dozen senators from both parties as you're kind of coming down the very tail end of that cybersecurity bill, which ought to frighten all of you, that it's a bunch of senators that truthfully don't know a whole lot about, this is the Gilligan's Island part. On this island, we're all Gilligans. Now, we probably got a couple of professors in the room here, the folks that know how to make a battery out of a coconut. But when it comes to cyber, we are all Gilligans. And particularly members of Congress are Gilligans. And so when it comes right down to the brass tacks and you're starting to develop a cybersecurity bill and you got a bunch of senators arguing over the different sections of it, that ought to give you some real pause. Now, during that discussion, the main point I was trying to make, we had just gone through the SOPA and PIPA. Remember that? The Stop Online Privacy Act, the Protect IP Act. And in a day, that piece of legislation was totally taken off the table by the big internet companies with a pretty effective public relations online campaign. So my point was, if you're going to write this bill in terms of trying to provide information sharing and some measure of cybersecurity through regulation, if you write it so it facilitates the private sector rather than dictating to it. I come from the private sector. I think the members of the private sector understand that government really has a fair amount to offer here. It really does. There's a lot of expertise, particularly in the Defense Department. So the private sector understands that, and they would like government to offer some guidance, some ground rules to help facilitate information sharing, provide liability protection, do the things that government has to do, but only those things. And so as I talked about facilitating rather than dictating, I was a lone voice. I got significant pushback. Oh, no. Private sector will never do this unless we shove it down their throats, unless we dictate it to them. Well, I hate to say, I told you so. But that's exactly the kind of bill that they wrote, and that was SOPA and PIPA'd in short order. Now, one other thing I want to point out about that bill, during one of those hearings, which is one of the reasons I was, by the way, that was a good thing that bill did not pass. During those hearings, I asked one of the witnesses, I think is a member of DHS, how long would it take you to write the regulations that you're contemplating in this piece of legislation? The answer literally was 4 years. Now, how much is the internet going to change in 4 years by the time the federal government has actually written the regulation to regulate it? We've seen how long it's taken on the Volcker rule. Is that thing written yet? How many years has it been since that piece of legislation was passed, and we still don't have a lot of the underlying regulation done? So, again, my point being is the federal government is not going to be the entity to solve our cybersecurity woes, which are incredibly serious threats to this nation. We have passed the CISA Act, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. Our committee's input into that was the Federal Cybersecurity Enhancement Act. I will say that the reviews on that are quite mixed. It was primarily an information sharing bill. There's been, I think, some additional information sharing, but when I talk to private sector folks, I think there's still a fair amount of concern about really opening up. And so I don't think it's been particularly efficient and effective at doing what needs to be done. One of our last hearings, and by the way, under our committee, we actually have a mission statement. Kind of unusual, but I'm a business guy. Our mission statement is primarily to enhance the economic and national security of America. And on the Homeland Security side of our committee, we have 4 top priorities: border security, cybersecurity, protecting critical infrastructure. It's got an awful lot of cybersecurity element to that, and countering violent extremists, which also has an awful lot of internet and cyber connection as well. So this is something we've taken very seriously. I've been involved in probably in our committee alone close to a dozen hearings over the last 6 years. In our last hearing, I thought there were 2 big points made. We had one witness that used the analogy of Flint, Michigan, with the water contamination issue. And the analogy was, what we're trying to do with cybersecurity would be the same thing as if Flint, Michigan required every household to install an incredibly expensive filtration system and then maintain a reporting process to the federal government, making sure that filtration system was working properly, and then be held liable if they didn't do it quite right. Well, that's not the way to solve the Flint, Michigan water crisis. The best way to do that would be fix the primary water treatment facility, right? Well, the analogy was, well, that's what we need to do in terms of cybersecurity. We need to, as much as possible, provide cybersecurity at the source, with the hardware, with the software. Make it as easy as possible for all of us Gilligans to maintain as good a cybersecurity on our own systems as well. The other point, and I think this is really relevant, again, to the ineffectiveness, the inefficiency of government. One of our witnesses, and by the way, this is very prevalent in terms of industry, was talking about the onerous nature of federal regulation on cybersecurity departments within the private sector. Now, in that same hearing, we had the chancellor of UW-Madison, not exactly a conservative bastion. The last 2 years, the chancellor has come into my office, and her primary ask has been to reduce government regulation on the university system. Last year, she came in armed with a study commissioned by other research universities that said that 42% of researcher time spent on federal grants. Now, these are the grants from hard-working taxpayers granted to universities to advance human knowledge, to cure diseases. 42% of their researcher time is spent basically filling out paperwork for the federal government. It was the exact same complaint of this cybersecurity expert within the private sector. Said 40% of his time, his department's time, is spent complying with federal regulations. That is absurd. Think of the opportunity cost. So if there's one message I'm trying to convey here, the solution in terms of our cybersecurity threats, which again are serious, they are growing, they're metastasizing. The solution doesn't lie in the federal government. Yes, we need to do certain things. We need to provide a regulatory framework that can facilitate what the private sector is going to do. But don't rely on the federal government to solve this problem. I'm relying on you. Now, what are some of the good things the federal government has actually done? You know, when Lieberman Collins failed, NIST stepped up to the plate and offered their 2014 framework, and they continued to work on frameworks for manufacturing. Now, from my standpoint, that was actually part of that hearing as well. Incredibly complex. I'm thinking of my ISO certification process. Okay, I got it. It's going to be government, it's going to be complex, but it's a complex problem. But utilizing that NIST framework, that's a good voluntary type of guideline. But from my standpoint, I think the most powerful discipline, the most powerful tool we can use is literally the insurance model. Again, I come from manufacturing. Because we had to insure our property, our plant, we installed sprinklers a whole lot closer together so we would have lower insurance rates. And of course, the insurance companies came in and they brought in the inspectors, free of charge to us, but it was in the insurance company's best interest to make sure that we were complying. So you combine the NIST framework with some kind of private sector, like an ISO certification model, combined with insurance products that will have to be developed over many years. Nothing simple about this, because the financial vulnerability is hard to really contemplate, but of course you can cap it in an insurance product. But I think that's exactly the private sector model that is going to have the greatest chance of staying up to date, not take 4 years to write a regulation, but will continuously update what those regulations, what those frameworks, what those guidelines need to be to do the best possible job of making our defense start catching up with the offense. One of the questions I always ask experts is, where are we at? I hate to say there's been any advantage to having all these high-profile attacks, but the advantage is it's certainly raised awareness. Over the years, as you've seen Target and Sony and OPM and now Equifax, it has raised the awareness in the top management levels of businesses that this is a serious issue. It threatens their business. It threatens our economy. So again, that awareness combined with the private sector model, truthfully, is the solution. And my final point then is, as you experts, you professors out here, as you're coming to conclusions, you do need to come and talk to us Gilligans in Congress and let us know what laws do we need to pass to facilitate what the private sector must do to really address this incredibly serious problem. With that, again, I just wish you a good day and good conference.